to.
Hey everyone, welcome to a very special edition of Until Saturday. We've got one of our favorite friends here with us, Matt Brown from Extra Points. I'm Nicole Auerbach. He's Chris Vanini. This is going to be a fun one. There's been so much happening off the field in college football, and we're covering all of it, as you've seen on this feed. This week, we are covering everything you need to know in this sport all off season. So follow this podcast on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Please help support the show by dropping a 5-star review. You can also subscribe to Until Saturday on YouTube so you can watch us just like you're watching today's show, and leave us a voicemail on our Until Saturday phone line for future mailbags, 316-462-9852. We are framing this first conversation with our pal Matt Brown as fact versus fiction, because Matt does a great job of sifting through that for his Extra Points newsletter. But before we get into all the serious stuff, Matt, we just wanted to say thank you for doing this. And also, oh my God, how many pennants do you have on that wall?
I think we're close to 80 at this point, and it's kind of fun. Like there's a few other pennants that you can't see. They're on different walls. But when I am interviewing an AD or a president at this point, the first thing they ask is like, "Where's my school?" And my answer is usually, "Well, here's my PO box. If I couldn't find it on Etsy right now, there's a reason why." And they send it to me, and it's been kind of fun. I need to do a better job of rearranging it depending on who I'm talking to right now, so I can pander to the local market.
That's awesome. That is awesome. How much do those things cost?
If you're lucky, you can get them for like $8. The really little ones were all made in like the late 1950s, and every once in a while though they're like, this one's $170. I'm like, I'm not buying that one then.
What about the Best Dad University one?
Nicole,
that priceless?
Priceless. No, that was my Christmas present last year. My daughter's made that for me.
Oh,
that's awesome.
It's very sweet. The pizza slice. I don't know if I've told you guys this story. That came from this fact that about a year ago, I remember driving to the gym, and my youngest, she's 5. She's like, "You need to go to the gym because you're looking a little bit pumped up right now, Dad." My oldest is like, "You can't say pumped up. I mean, you can't say you should know." My youngest, I was looking fat, which is true. And the oldest is like, "You can't say Dad's fat. He's pumped up. That's why he goes to the gym." And Estella's like, "Yeah, pumped up on pizza." And so now, pizza's the callback there. That's what happens when you're working late, when you're traveling, when you're going through FOIA directories. Sometimes maybe you don't eat as many vegetables as you'd like.
It's true.
Anybody who follows Matt on Twitter is familiar with his kids, and when they hijack his Twitter account,
I enjoy those. Those are always my favorite.
At this point, I've given up on password protection because Penny's better at this stuff than I am. We should just put her to work.
It is great to have you, and I'm glad that we are catching you this week of all weeks, because we booked you before the Tennessee lawsuit dropped, and I really want to get your thoughts on that. But we got to start with what you were just talking about, all the FOIAs. You do a great job of, it's the Freedom from Information Act. You are submitting this. You're trying to get information from schools that is difficult to get. And you and your colleague, Andy Wittry, just spent a ton of time trying to set the record straight on NIL. Fans are under this impression that some teams' NIL efforts exceed 8 figures, that rosters are excessively expensive. There's just been a lot of speculation around it in general. You've also had coaches just kind of throw out numbers of, Matt Rule saying a good quarterback could cost $2 million a year. And Ohio State spent $13 million on the roster, which was something that Ryan Day had said, as reported by Doug Lesmerises. So, we want to figure out exactly what is really happening. You have looked at 40 nonprofit NIL disclosure forms that got sent to the IRS in the fiscal year 2022. So tell us what you learned, what people are actually spending on NIL.
Yeah. So the reason we did this, right, is if we want to compare athletic department budgets, it's not a perfect comparison, but even if you're a private school, there's standardized financial accounting that's shared with everybody. We can go on the Knight Newhouse database or USA Today or Sportico. We can pull up what the budget forms were disclosed to the NCAA. And even private schools have to share something with the Department of Education in what's called the EADA directory. So you can get some very high level information. But for NIL, none of that really exists. We have sometimes open doors, or sometimes CNIL, or sometimes a couple of individual groups will share some high level data. But then there's a lot of rumor and innuendo, like you stated. And for most of these groups, there's not a way to compel them to open the books, no matter how politely and non-threateningly I ask. But many collectives right now are established as 501c3s. And they do this so they can tell donors, if you give me money, it's tax deductible. And if you do that, that also means that your 990, your disclosure form, is a public record and anybody can go look at it. So me and Andy, we looked through, actually like more than 60 of these things, but because it's for the last tax year. So it's fiscal year 22, and most of them were established in the fall of that year. So you're going to see a lot of groups saying we only raised 60 grand. We only raised 80 grand. When everyone files their taxes for last year, and we begin to see these over the coming months, I expect those numbers to grow. But they're, from what we saw, there really weren't very many groups reporting big money. The Friends of Notre Dame reported, I think close to $8 million. And you had Clemson and Texas and Ohio State, with some of their secondary collectives reporting budgets in the 2s and 3s. But that wasn't really the standard. And the thing that surprised me a little bit, although we've had tax professors and other experts in the space say it's not nefarious, it's not unusual, but most of these groups didn't distribute anywhere close to all the money that they got. They got $2 million in donations or brand deals or everything else. They might have only paid athletes 700 grand, 600 grand, $1 million. And part of that is because you have to keep the powder dry for the next recruiting class. You're not necessarily sure if the donations are going to slow down in the future, if you're going to move along and everything here. But the total budget is not what's actually being given to athletes. And that's something to think about here. And I think it's worth asking other questions about if that money is just being held. Is it being held for future recruiting classes? Is it being held for consulting fees? Is it being held for lawyers or marketing arrangements? There's overhead to all of this. That's certainly much higher than 0%.
So there's been a lot of talks, especially in light of the Tennessee stuff, in terms of public support for athletes. And in some of the examples you had in your article, 50 to 80% of donations are from large donors. Sometimes how like political PACs work and stuff like that. How should people kind of consider what collectives are, where their money is coming from, and whether or not this is really the public kind of supporting the schools, or is it a handful of big donors?
So there's what things are right now, and there's what the schools and collective operators would like it to be. And they're really two different things. What we're seeing right now, both in terms of, LLC, private collectives, and these more public nonprofit ones, almost across the board, is that the vast majority of their budgets are coming from whales, what we would call a handful of really big donors, 5, 8, 10, 12 people who are cutting 6 and 7 figure checks. Similar, like you said, to a lot of political action committees. And if you talk to a development professional, they'll tell you, it's much cheaper to get one guy to give you $1 million than it is to get 1,000 people or 10,000 people to give you smaller amounts of money. But the smaller donors and a wider net is much more sustainable. Because one of the things that everybody realized is that the kind of guy that's going to cut a $500,000 check to buy athletes for recruiting is a flaky person. It's somebody whose wealth might not necessarily be liquid. They might be temperamental. They might want more influence in the recruiting process. They might have a beef with the coach. You don't want to rely on 3 guys, just like that was the case in the backman world as well, right? You didn't want to be, let essentially the local Dodge dealer be your GM. And the way to fix that is by appealing to a really broad base of donors. And that's what almost everyone's trying to do. You're going to see a lot more an emphasis on these subscription packages. Hey, I need everybody on my message board to pay me $8, $10, $12 a month. I'm going to give you some content. I'm going to throw you some swag so we can build a huge, broad donor base. And that's not really happening yet. It's that people are getting there. But I am personally deeply sympathetic to the argument that claim sucks. If you're somebody who is already paying $75 for a ticket, $40 to park, maybe $500 for donations for a personal seat license, and you're being nickeled and dimed everywhere else, to have a coach who makes $6, $7, $8 million come up there and say, if you don't give us more money, our team's going to lose because we're poor, I think that's outrageous. And that's we're stuck in that world until we move to wherever college sports is going right now. I understand why some people feel like I got to cut the check because the most important thing in the world to me is beating Purdue. But, I wouldn't give them any of my money. And I would be very sympathetic to a fan, somebody who's not making 500 grand saying, no, leave that to the venture capital and the real estate development people. I'm just trying to watch the game.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm glad you brought it up because we have seen a lot of that since the season ended. Even after season-ending losses, we've seen that fundraising effort for the everyday fan, or pleas from coaches who make, $5 to $10 million a year, asking for money. So I'm glad you brought that up because it is a weird middle ground that we're in as we wait for, one of these dominoes, one of these court cases to change the model itself. You do have this NIL world, these collectives, this whole system that operates. So you mentioned that the information you got was because people were submitting information to the IRS and they were trying to be nonprofits. Does that even make sense? Like, are they really nonprofit organizations? Like, I think this was something I was surprised about from the very beginning. Just because you had a couple players do a couple charity events doesn't necessarily make you a charity.
Yeah, I mean, so there's different flavors of nonprofits, right? And I think that you could make a credible argument that an NIL collective could meet one of those particular, nonprofit definitions. We have unions that are nonprofits. We have social organizations that are nonprofits. The key question, though, is are they charities? Are they a 501c3? And what that allows is not only can the donor get a tax break for giving to that organization, but if then the 501c3 is holding $750,000 in cash at the end of the year, they're not taxed on that. The only taxes are on given to the player when he does the work and reports down his income taxes. And every single tax professional, every professor of accounting, every CPA since I've been on this beat since 2021 has been uniformly in agreement that there's no way in hell that these groups should be considered 501c3 charities. That the idea, it's great that athletes are doing charitable work. Paying a left tackle $100,000 to read to children is not charity. That's work. Or if you want to be cynical about it, that's money laundering.
Yes.
And now the IRS, right, last summer essentially said the same thing, but they didn't make that law. They just put out a memo saying, hey, want to clarify something. This shouldn't be a collective. I mean, this shouldn't be a charity. And in our reporting, we talked to some of these groups and some of them said, all right, we'll switch to a 501c4 model, or we'll switch to an LLC model. And many of them have told us we didn't really see that big of a change in fundraising because the lower donation people are taking the standard deduction. And the Stephen Rosses of the world, the hyper rich people, they've got other tax shelters. Like they're not relying on this thing to avoid paying taxes. But some of them haven't. And the cynical bet that I think many of these operators are making is the IRS takes forever to investigate anybody. And they can't investigate all of us. We have 40 plus of these groups here. They might sue 2 or 3 of us. We'll get a slap on the wrist. We'll lose the designation. But the championship banners are going to hang forever. The guys, the people.
This is kind of the same strategy with the NCAA, right?
That's
like
exactly
if everybody is,
Yeah,
if everybody's doing it, a couple people get dinged, but isn't it worth it?
And that's kind of the lead, and I think here to Tennessee, because honestly, I don't think that calculus is wrong, right? And it's the same calculus any of us make when we speed. It was, if everybody's going 7 to 10 miles over the speed limit, I'm going to be disadvantaged if I drive the speed limit. And some of us are going to get a ticket, but most of us aren't. And since I don't think anyone's going to go to jail for saying that their collective was a charity when it wasn't, they might just pay a small fine and change their classification. I understand why some of these groups are saying, let's do what we can to, get our $9 million SEC payroll, and we'll deal with the IRS when we get there. I might not personally think that that's like ethical, but that's the calculus. It's the same thing, exactly the same thing people do with the NCAA. Now, the IRS could put you in jail. They're probably not going to do that for this. Stakes are a little bit higher than they are for the NCAA.
How are collectives generally spending this money? I think you had something in there about TCU's collective was paying like $60K to baseball and basketball players. This is something Charlie Baker has talked about, and whether or not these things fall under Title IX, if you're an official collective with the school. What have you kind of discovered in terms of where a lot of the money is going?
There's a huge variance. And I think that's one of the challenges in trying to write about this beat, because collective is kind of a stand-in for a ton of different kind of organizations, right? And even now in 2024, we have technical collectives that are not much more sophisticated than a couple of message board dads. And what they're essentially doing is like, I'm just passing the hat on Venmo, man. You guys, leak some stuff in the DMs and we'll pay you $400. And the entire operating budget couldn't buy a Kia. And like, that's a thing that exists. And then you have some that are baby versions of Rock Nation or CAA. They're enormous marketing agencies, and some of them are even run for profit. like explicitly for profit. The biggest expense generally is still paying the athletes. But collective organizations typically need to spend some money on legal fees, not just for a corporation, but for contract review. Many of them spend money on marketing and trying to reach and engage in other donors. They spend money in trying to engage and reach out with brands. Some of them, co-brand and co-host events. And then you have insurance costs, you have physical costs, and you might split that with the athlete, everything else. I don't think there's a lot of examples of like individual collective operators who are looking at this as their job and getting rich. Like a lot of the people that are listed here as presidents or board members in these groups, they're already independently wealthy. The way that people are making money from this is as the middleman vendors, I think, as the go-between and serving a bunch of these collectives, rather than like the guy that's running the SMU collective himself. Like that's not the piggy bank for him. At least not what I've seen.
Yeah. I know the SMU collective, those people are legit like billionaires, Yeah. that is why that is why they're forgoing ACC money for a decade, because they have a lot of money.
And that's kind of the thing, right? Like there's different flavors of rich people that are involved in this, right? There's the rich people where I'm making a $300,000 salary and I can cut a big check, but I don't have complete FU money. And then I might buy a minority stake in a hockey team money. Right. And that's, you don't need to take a check from the collective if you're that kind of guy involved in this effort.
Yeah, just to put a pin on this, a great point in our comment section from Daniel. NIL being good at a school is a massive advantage in baseball where it's partial scholarship. So that's a really important thing to think about when we think about non-football and men's basketball, women's basketball as well, about things being actually a really important selling point for recruits. I do want to talk about Tennessee before we let you go, because Chris and I will chat after we send you off on your day, Matt, as well. But, there's been a lot of conversation around these lawsuits from the attorneys general in Tennessee and Virginia, taking aim at the NIL rules around recruiting inducements, essentially, right? The ability to sign deals with collectives before you enroll. That has been against the rules the whole time. We can argue, Chris and I, we can go back and forth about, how clear the rules were at the time or what was known or whatever, and how we think this lawsuit is going to go. But Matt, I want to start with you about is this actually the big one? People have been saying they think this is the big one. This is the one that's going to topple the NCAA system. But to me, it's narrow, and it's just about this rule or the ability to have rules against recruiting inducements. So, but I want to get your thoughts. Where do you see this in comparison to other legal challenges, to other just existential threats, as NCAA presidents love to call them, to the system itself? Is this the one that's going to be the domino?
Yeah. First of all, I want to just very quickly, kudos for attorneys general, right? Like every
I have been practicing that.
I can tell everybody with the AP style handbook somewhere just smiled, nailed it. No,
weird plural.
Weird plural. This is a really important case. I don't think it's the big one, right? And it's narrow in a couple of different ways. Like for one, even though the NCAA is having a terrible record right now in court on antitrust, I know we've talked to a couple of similar attorneys and professors, and I saw Michael McCann wrote this at Sportico. This isn't a slam dunk case. It's relatively narrow in scope. It's filed in a circuit that has historically been way more favorable to the NCAA than the Ninth, where the NCAA has gotten their ass kicked over the past couple of cases here. There's a reason there's really only 2 state AGs joining this rather than the much wider and bipartisan group over transfer restrictions that we saw here a little while ago. So this is a case that Tennessee could lose. They might win, they might lose in court. That's how things happen. But this is not an open and shut game over kind of thing. And it's not exactly, as I understand it, about enforcing any NIL rules, but about a relatively specific, can the player talk with the collective during the recruiting process, which is, what Florida State was dinged for as well. It's important and influential, and especially because if Tennessee and Virginia win, it's going to embolden a bunch of other state attorneys general and to go after a couple of other things. But we have to remember, we're also looking at Johnson, which is, we're going to get something about that this year, which would potentially list athletes as employees, not just at the Tennessees and UVAs of the world, but at FCS kind of schools, which would impact so many more athletes. You have House, which I'm almost positive is going to get settled before it goes to trial next year. But if it goes to trial and the NCAA loses, they are literally bankrupt. even with the new women's basketball tournament, and not only them, but potentially power conferences and low major conferences facing enormous damages, upwards of $10 million a year per institution. That would be catastrophic to the industry. And when I say the industry, I'm not just talking about the schools and the conferences, but like to Learfield, to Playfly, to Anthony Travel, to anybody else that does businesses with these schools. Because if you're going to pay an extra $15 million a year, you're cutting back on a bunch of other things that would impact thousands of jobs. This is important, but I think there's some hyperbole right now over the rush to be the guy that beats the dead horse of the NCAA. Nobody likes to be on the side of the mall cops in recruiting. And especially because I think Tennessee and some of the folks in that orbit are trying to whip people into a frenzy. We can debate if the rules are dumb. I think they're dumb. Most people think they're dumb. We can debate if the rules are legal. That's a great legal question. I don't think we should debate whether Tennessee knew the rules. Like, that's a little insulting to my intelligence, or the idea that the rules didn't exist beforehand. And I think Tennessee specifically would make a terrible martyr at the hands of NCAA investigation, given what that school and those administrators did with Jeremy Pruitt. Like, we can make this into a bunch of other things here, right? But let's not build the statue to Tennessee.
Yeah, I mean, but also we don't even know a lot of these details yet. There isn't an NOA. All that's technically out there is the New York Times report that it involved the plane ride for Nico. I mean, and like, to your point, Tennessee knew this. I mean, its own guidelines on June 30th, 2021 said NIL can't be used in recruiting to convince someone to come. That was, everybody knew that's what the rule was. The guidance that came out 10 months later was collectives count as boosters, just in case you weren't sure about that, because collectives were a new thing. And the NCAA said at the time, this is mostly about moving forward, except in a few cases retroactively that were pretty severe. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Florida and Tennessee, two of the ones that were pretty open and brazen about their situation, are the ones involved in this. We at The Athletic wrote multiple stories about the specific people at Tennessee and the people who were involved in that. And it turns out going public about the things that you're doing that may or may not be NCAA violations is going to get the attention of the NCAA. So yes, I don't buy this retroactively they threw in these rules and now Tennessee's getting punished for that. No, Tennessee knew what the rules were. They're not going to court to say we didn't break the rules. They're going to court, or the state is going to court to say the rules are illegal. You know, that is what this is really about. So sometimes it gets focused in on the minutia of Nico. Tennessee's a big SEC school with a huge fan base, so it drums up a lot more attention than something like House does. But yeah, this is pretty specific and narrow. This is Tennessee and Virginia, the states, saying boosters should be allowed to meet with and pay recruits. That's it.
Yeah, I think kind of on that super fast. There's, I think, a little bit of a fan misunderstanding about this. It's not that there's somebody in Indianapolis that has a vendetta against Tennessee or the state of Florida or anything here. A lot of these early investigations are centering on stuff that was plastered in billboards and like it was not subtle at all. And if there's a few agents, if there's a few runners or industry personnel that have, are tied to a couple of these cases at once, that's more of the thread here. It's not that like we got to get Tennessee. It's more like, hey, the world's dumbest NIL lawyer who was giving all of these interviews in 2022 about how I'm definitely committing crew crimes. Maybe they're going to investigate that guy for crew crimes. Like, if you're going to break the rules that you think are stupid, but that you agreed to, maybe not, far be it for me to want to say, don't talk to reporters. I love it when you talk to reporters, but maybe don't talk to reporters if you're doing something that could get you in trouble.
Yeah, I think
I support doing it though. I would say keep doing that.
Yeah, it's obviously not an accident that like the most brazen examples, the examples people were pointing to at the time that were public, are the ones that the NCAA is looking at now, and we'll continue to see more information. Matt, before we let you go, we have to ask you the question that you get asked all the time because you are the expert on this, and that is about NCAA football, the video game coming back, EA Sports. Everyone freaks out. I feel like every 3 to 4 days, worried that this game is not going to happen or something is going to be delayed. So what is the absolute latest as we are recording this about the state of the game?
Absolute latest. I understand if you are a diehard video game fan and you don't want to take my word on something, even though I'm getting it directly from the company. That's great, right? By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, blah blah blah. I remember Sunday school. Like I understand. The EA just had an investor call where they confirmed and talked about this, like literally on the call. Yes, the game's coming out this summer. We had like a VP of marketing retweet me a couple of weeks ago and said, yes, the game's coming out this summer. The CEO of the company gave an interview with Sportico and said, yes, the game's coming out this summer. So I would prefer if you took my word for it. I've been on this beat since the game was announced. I was the guy that broke the initial release date. I was the guy that broke that it was being delayed. I've shared a bunch of information, but I'm not an all-seeing oracle. But so you could just listen to a bunch of people that have EA email addresses that are all saying the game is coming out this summer. Just because we haven't released a specific release date does not mean the game is not coming out.
When will we know when, or a time frame ish? Do we?
I mean, so like the game's coming out in July. Like EA isn't saying that. I'm saying that it's coming out in July. I don't know exactly what date yet. I would imagine,
which is when it always came out.
Which is when it always comes out. Exactly. And the reason like they're not confirming, hey, it's not the 8th or the 12th or the 15th. A lot of that's about trucks. Like that's not because we don't know if the game is going to be done yet. It's what we're going to get the physical, CDs from the factory to GameStop in time. We got to figure that stuff out. We'll know more, I would say, over the next 8 weeks, not just about exact date, but things like cover athletes and things like the company themselves being more willing to pull back the curtain. That was always the plan, to do that in February to early March and ramp that up over the summer. And that's how literally every sports video game is done. I would love if they leaked more things to me, and if not me, to your local beat writer, to Vanini, to everybody else. That's not how EA operates. I beg of you to be patient.
Yes. Well, you and we've both talked to people in the company and outside the company. It's happening. People freaked out about the Brander lawsuit. You and I kept saying, guys, this is not, it's fine. It's going to be okay. Dude, it was, and it will be.
How did you get a lot of DMs yesterday about people freaking out about the Tennessee lawsuit and whether that does anything to the game? Because I got more than 10.
That does not.
I grew up on the game. You grew up on the game. We go crazy. We love this thing. I have been blown away just how like next level the craziness over some of this was. It has admittedly taken me aback in terms of like every little thing people worry it's not going to result in the game coming out. Guys, it's coming out. It's fine.
They love this thing. It's going to look totally different though too, with the portal and all of that. It's going to be really fun. Well, Matt, we've kept you long enough. We really appreciate you making time for us today, making us smarter. We hope to have you back. And if you want to read Matt's work and become smarter, subscribe to the Extra Points newsletter, now under new ownership. It's absolutely worth your money and worth your time. Thanks so much, Matt.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Take care, guys.
All right, Chris and I are going to continue onward without our buddy as we go here. And Chris, I did want to kind of round out that Tennessee conversation because we need to let Matt go. Is there anything else that you find interesting about it as it's unfolding so far? Obviously, it's an evolving story, but we hit on a couple different things about what it's centered on, what the arguments that Tennessee is making in defense of themselves. Just how do you see where this is going?
Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate or realize that the lawsuit is extremely different than the NCAA investigation. Like it is not about what specifics of the contract. It's not about whether or not Spire Sports is a collective or a marketing agency or whatever. That's not what the lawsuit is. The lawsuit about is just saying not allowing recruits to be involved in NIL is an antitrust violation. It's not even suing on the grounds of state laws. It's just suing on the grounds of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so it's not about, this lawsuit is not about upending the NCAA. It's not about employment. It's not about taking it down. It's not about a breakaway. It's literally just boosters should be able to meet with and pay recruits. That's it. Now, the NCAA case is a bit different. Again, we don't know a lot of those details yet because a lot of the stuff has not come out. Had Pat Forty not reported that there was an investigation a few days ago, a lot of this may not have happened yet. A lot of people at Tennessee didn't even know exactly what it was about at the time. So there's still a lot that we don't know. And so people are ready to, again, jump on that. This is the big one. This is the big fight. And look, it'll be a big deal if NIL recruiting laws go away and you're allowed to openly do that. But as we just talked about the first half hour of this podcast, it's already going on. Like everybody's using NIL for recruiting. We know that. I actually think the transfer lawsuit and the opening up of multi-time transfers is actually way more impactful on college football and college sports than whatever this Tennessee one comes up at. So like it's juicy. It's a big deal. It's just not existential like I think a lot of people are hyping it up to be.
Yeah, and again, like we've kind of had people do that each time there's been a challenge. I think as soon as the multi-time transfer lawsuit was successful and got its TRO and eventually got a preliminary injunction, it's extending through the rest of the academic year. I think I said to you, Chris, like people are going to immediately start suing over individual NCAA rules, right? Because you have a different legal environment after the Alston ruling, Supreme Court ruling against the NCAA, and then a number of other lawsuits popping up. But to Matt's point earlier, I do think Johnson and House are the two big ones to watch. Like those are the ones that gets ruled against the NCAA, or in a settlement, you have to make you agree to certain things. That changes the model, the system itself. And Johnson, like that makes everyone hourly wage employees. They're filling out timesheets. Overnight changes the model. So that's where I think this stuff is super fascinating. And obviously Tennessee is going guns blazing here, which is different. Like FSU had NIL violations, but they just accepted them. It was a negotiated resolution. They took the suspension, they took the penalties and moved on. And there will probably be other NIL cases that do that, but Tennessee is fighting back at the rules themselves. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And I'm already interested in the mixed reviews on that, because obviously there's a lot of anti-NCAA support right now from the public, from within the system as well. But also part of the reason that these rules existed in the first place was people wanted the NCAA to enforce them, is because they don't want this to be a free for all. And just like people just, here's how much you can come to if you come to my school, which is essentially what would happen if this goes a certain outcome.
Right. I don't know if you're going to have a lot of schools and states jump on board with the Tennessee one to say, yeah, this is what we want. It happened with transfers because lots of different schools had various transfers get denied. And it was a lot of different things. I don't think the schools really want NIL to be open for recruiting. I don't think the other thing that could happen down the road, there's a lot of these like antitrust cases you could make. One of them being, as we've said on this podcast before, the concept of eligibility. You can go to college for as many years as you want. And so what's to stop somebody from saying, I should be able to play college football as long as I want? And because of NIL, you're limiting my ability to make money by only having 4 or 5 years of eligibility. Nobody really wants that to happen, though. So that's like, as these schools are or states and schools are kind of going after the NCAA, they also don't want to tear the entire thing down at the same time. And so there's this really delicate balance, inconsistency. The NCAA just keeps saying, look, we're enforcing the rules you have asked us to enforce. That's what we're doing. You called it the Wild West. You were upset about the multi-time transfers. Okay, we're going to crack down on those. And then they get sued over it. And now we have unlimited transfers. So like they keep opening up these boxes on accident, and I don't know where it's going. We got a good mailbag question later in the podcast that we'll get to that kind of touches on what this all means for college football just as a fan.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a second. I want to move on to talk about some late surprising coaching carousel news. Chris, you have been warning us for months now that there's always late surprises. The Saban retirement we thought was one. We kind of thought Jim Harbaugh was going to go to the NFL. Michigan promoted from within, so that one wasn't a terrible surprise. Jeff Hafley leaving Boston College to become the defensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers on January 31st. That qualifies as a surprise. So this is we're going to start using the term P4, right? Because the Pac-12 is going away this year. So this is a P4 opening. But it's also created a lot of questions, in part because of the way it was reported. Pete Thamel broke the news for ESPN, and then he included this quote from a source about the decision. I'll read the full quote, Chris, and then I'll get your reaction, because this is what prompted an entire conversation. It's kind of been a multi-day conversation about the state of college football. This is the quote. He wants to go coach football again in a league that is all about football. college coaching has become fundraising, NIL, and recruiting your own team and transfers. There's no time to coach anymore. A lot of the things he went back to college for have disappeared. So, do you buy that, Chris? Is that a trend line? Is that something that should be worrisome to people about college football? We've been hearing this the last few years about the calendar and the schedule and roster management. And it's a real thing. These are really time-consuming issues. They're challenges. They didn't exist a long time ago. They didn't exist before the portal opened to this extent, the one-time transfer, all of these things. So let's talk about, again, fact versus fiction, how much this is actually impacting decisions like this.
Does every coach feel this way? Yes. Does it matter? That depends. Number of years ago, 7, 8 years ago, back when I was at Coaching Search, I remember listening to an interview on an Atlanta radio station with a coach who said that every coach he knows is trying to get to the NFL because recruiting is just too much. It's 24/7, it's on vacation, it's everything. And everybody he knows is trying to get to the NFL. That coach was then Alabama defensive coordinator Kirby Smart. Kirby Smart's still in college football. Kirby Smart's making about $10 million a year. He ain't going to the NFL. It's not the head coaches leaving for the NFL that concern me in terms of the work-life balance. Being a head coach has always been fundraising and doing other things, literally forever. That's what the job is. Yes, it's more of that now than ever. But Jim Harbaugh and Jeff Hafley are very, very unique situations. Jim Harbaugh had been an NFL head coach before. We know he wants to win the Super Bowl. He also just won the national championship. He's accomplished everything he needed to do. Jeff Hafley spent a lot of time in the NFL and had a resume that speaks to a guy who wants to go be in the NFL and not be a college football coach forever. He was also only making $3 million. He wasn't making $8-9 million. So he's going to NFL where he'll get a salary that's pretty similar, most likely. Green Bay Packers defense coordinator. The problem with all this additional stress on coaches is at the assistant level, the lower levels, the guys who are the ones who have to do more of the work than the head coach really, and they're not getting paid millions of dollars to do that. They end up getting out of the profession. That is the concern, I think, long-term about what this stuff does to coaching. Also, Nick Saban is like 73 years old. He was going to retire any year anyway. I think these individual cases are unique in their own way. And just the fact that they happen around this time, people want to say, oh, NIL and transfers are ruining college sports. We got to do this. I think it's a bit of an overreaction. Not every college coach can go to the NFL. It's hard to go there if you haven't already been in the NFL, as Jim Harbaugh and Jeff Hafley were. So I think it's a real concern, but it's also an overreaction, the idea that this is going to ruin college football.
I think we went through this a little bit with some of the decisions in college basketball as well. So you had the retirement of a lot of Hall of Fame coaches, right, who were up there in age, like you mentioned Saban, right? So you had Coach K and Roy Williams and those types of coaches. And then you also had Jay Wright step away, and he was younger and he was going to be the face of college basketball. We had these conversations then, and I think they're similar where absolutely it's a factor. I'm sure the schedule is, if you want a quality of life, like, yeah, you retire when you can, or you do something else. If you love football and you want to coach more football, like if you want the ratio of your time spent doing football things to other things to be higher, the NFL will provide that. You want a real off season, you don't want to call teenagers all the time, like the NFL provides that. I just think that there are different decisions for different people. Like Matt Rule went to the NFL, it didn't work, comes back to college and is so much happier, right? He's so much happier at Nebraska. And like and Saban, right, too. Like guys who, they're different jobs in football. Depends what you want the job to look like. Do you want to be responsible for 17 to 22-year-olds and get those phone calls in the middle of the night that someone's, gotten a bar fight or whatever, and have to go help them through like these types of moments and help them develop and like this formative years? Or do you want to coach football with professionals who come in and leave, and they have their own nutritionists, their own trainers, and it's a totally different experience? So I think sometimes this stuff gets boiled down a little too simplistically when I do think that there are some coaches who prefer different pieces of both and consider themselves more of a college coach or more of a pro coach. Like there's different things. And there's a lot of coaches who go back and forth, right? Like you just mentioned, Harbaugh and Hafley have spent time in both. So it's just an interesting thing. And I think people are, a little bit oversimplifying to blame NIL and the portal and the roster management piece, which, by the way, again, like you want certain rules around that, but then when there are rules applied, they get sued. So then you might have less rules. Like it just becomes very challenging. And this will be, to Kirk Herbstreit's point, this will be way more simple whenever we get to an employment model, when there are contracts, when the roster management piece is a lot different. There will be a lot of other side effects and unintended side effects, but that piece will change for sure. I just think that Hafley in particular, at a Boston college that does not invest in the same way even that other ACC schools do in football, was going to enter the season on the hot seat. Like that's not, I don't think that's like the poster child for this concern, although the concern is valid about the schedule and the lifestyle.
And to Herbstreit's point, like the idea that coaches want to get to this the coaches are the ones complaining they don't think athletes should be employees too. Like they are out there.
Right.
Brian Kelly has said that. Other coaches have said this. So I don't want to hear that you don't want to go to that model when you also think that's the model that's going to save you. And again, the coaches who are making millions of dollars, they're not the ones I want to hear from on this. As has often been said on this podcast previously, that's what the money's for. You're making millions of dollars to fundraise, to do with the transfer portal, to keep your players, to deal with NIL. That's not my concern. My concern is the lower level coaches who don't get the opportunities or get out of the profession because it is too much. Because it is too much. It's ridiculous what college football coaches have to go through. And again, the vast majority of them are not the ones making millions of dollars. You have to be kind of crazy to be a football coach anyway. You have to devote so much of your time, start at the bottom, to get to where you want to be. So that is a concern. It's an issue for everybody. We'll get to something at some point. I don't know how. I don't know what it's going to look like. Yes, it needs to change. But I don't think Jeff Hafley is the poster child for college football is messed up. I got to go to the NFL.
There, just to answer one question that's coming up in the comments, he's probably not going to make more money. No, as the Packers defensive coordinator, but it's about a better salary, a better life, right? Because you don't have the recruiting piece. You don't have the off-season schedule, the December we talk about, right? So it's I think our friend Stephen Godfrey put it this way. It's like a better bag, not a bigger bag. It's a better overall package, right? So that's the way I think about that decision as well. Chris, before we wrap up,
what's $3 million when you only have 2 weeks off for the entire year,
Yeah,
as opposed to 1 million. And look, this might not be the last one. Chip Kelly's name has come up around many an NFL coordinator job. It's probably not going to happen in this cycle. It might in the next cycle. He's making like $6 million. But Chip Kelly is a guy who chose UCLA over Florida because he didn't want to do the recruiting and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So again, different people have different priorities. Joe Moorhead is a possibility, the Akron head coach of going to the NFL, but he's making like easily less than $1 million. Mike Bloomgren at Rice, potentially. Maybe he joins Harbaugh. I don't know. So there are some other coaches who could go to the NFL for various reasons, could keep that coaching carousel spinning.
Okay, we're recording this Thursday morning. So, Chris, why don't you quickly give us the names to watch with the Boston College job before we move on to FSU?
Yeah, Toledo head coach Jason Candle, Ohio State offense coordinator Bill O'Brien, Notre Dame defensive line coach Al Washington, who's a former BC player and interviewed last time, Dan Mullen, who's currently at ESPN, Northeast guy, Liam Cohen, the OC at Kentucky. I think those are a good chunk of the names to watch. Bob Chesney is a no, I've been told. He is the former head coach at Holy Cross. He almost beat Boston College this last year, but he took the James Madison job in December. Again, it's now February. Some guys don't want to leave their teams in February, especially when you just took the job. Everything I've been told is that Chesney is going to stick with James Madison as well. So it's a tough job. I had some coaches reach out to me yesterday and say, what do you think of the job? Like, how good is it? And they haven't won more than 7 games in a season since 2008, I believe, or 2009 maybe. But they're always in contention for bowl games. They're always at like 6 to 7 wins. Like, can you do any better than that? I'm not sure. The facilities are pretty good. They've upgraded some things, but it's a small alumni base. It's a private school. It's harder to do fundraising in a lot of these things. They've lost an AD to UCLA. They lost an AD to Penn State recently. Guys kind of come in and out of there. It's a tough job. We'll be curious how it goes.
All right, let's move on and talk about Florida State and their battle against the ACC, dueling lawsuits in this situation. There's been more filings and new complaints, and just wanted to hit on them because it's been a couple weeks since we talked about all of that, and that all blew up right before Christmas about Florida State challenging the ACC grant of rights. Now, part of their argument, or what they're trying to get across, is they don't think that the negotiations gave the ACC what it deserved or truly represented the value, especially of the FSU piece of this, and that the deal was bad, essentially, and that it's too long and it locked them in at a rate that was unacceptable. So there are a couple new pieces of information from what Florida State has put into the record. Basically the latest thing is that they are going after former Commissioner John Swofford. His son worked at Raycom and moved his way up, and the ACC gave Raycom a special carve out of the ACC deal to keep it afloat after the SEC went to ESPN. That ended up making it harder for the ACC to create its own network because ESPN didn't have all of the exclusive rights. And this package, this Raycom piece, is actually, if I have this correct, Chris, this is the package that's now on CW. It's like this.
Yes, it's like the tier 2 and tier 3.
Yeah. So it's the package that now was on CW. So it's
Raycom produces that stuff for CW, by the way. So they're still kind of involved in that. Yeah.
Okay, so that was one of the takeaways, right? Is creating this dynamic of John Swofford maybe hooking his son up with a pretty good deal that didn't actually benefit the ACC in the way that it should have, and then just some other information about procedural things, right? So that, the ACC didn't have a 2/3 vote from the membership before it filed its lawsuit in North Carolina against FSU. And it had that threshold when it sued Maryland. The ACC put out some TV trade secrets first because their lawsuit was before Florida State's lawsuit. And that was one of their pushbacks, was that Florida State isn't supposed to be talking about this stuff. This is supposed to be confidential information. So, Chris, anything that really caught your eye in this latest round of filings?
Yeah, look, it's hard. Some of this is compelling. Some of it is just complaining. And I'm not a lawyer, but when you talk to lawyers about this stuff, a lot of them looked at the initial FSU complaint and just said, this is like a message board screed. This isn't like, you're not making legal cases on various things. And part of that reason is because Florida State signed off on all of this stuff. They signed off on the grant of rights. They signed off on the ESPN deal. It's not like they didn't know certain stuff was happening. Florida State is trying to make the case that it was either coerced into it or that it had to sign certain things, either because the exit fee had been made too high or because ESPN supposedly had some sort of ultimatum that the grant of rights had to be extended to 2036. What is most interesting to me is that ACC deal with ESPN does not extend to 2036 right now. It only extends to, I think, 2026, 27.
Yes.
And there was a deadline for ESPN to decide to extend that was in 2021. And Jim Phillips, a commissioner, extended that to 2025 instead. And he told ACC schools at the time, the state of the landscape, we may be able to negotiate a better thing with ESPN if we delay this. And FSU says it's been 2 years. We've gotten nothing better. He also unilaterally did that and didn't have votes to do that or whatever. That is the most compelling thing, that if they could argue that they can get out of things by 2027 instead of 2036. They're arguing the exit fee shouldn't be applied because it's way too high. It's ridiculous. Or they're saying the grant of rights shouldn't exist because it was coerced into it and stuff like that. So it's trying to negate all of these things that are keeping it in the ACC right now. That is kind of the first step. So, they keep adding certain things to these complaints here and there. It's still hard, very, very hard to tell which way it's going to go.
One other interesting piece of information is that UNC's board of trustees is talking about things a little bit. So from Inside Carolina, this is the board of trustees chair, John Pryor. I think we all have an obligation to assess the financial realities and make the best decision based on those realities. If the current financial model of the Atlantic Coast Conference doesn't improve, then it would cause real concern about how Carolina could continue to maintain its excellence in athletics. The door is open.
So this, you may have missed this because you were on vacation with certain things going on that we'll get to at the end. North Carolina's board passed a policy, like this whole system passed a policy about a week ago that gives the UNC system board of governors and the president basically approval or denial of conference changes. So the change must be approved by, it may not be official yet, but it's moving forward in various committees. The governance committee, I think, approved it last week. It's going to allow the president and the board to weigh in on potential impacts of conference realignment. A lot of people took this to mean the board may not let UNC go without NC State because they're in the same system. Then you have the board of trustees chair, John Pryor, basically saying what you said, which is, hey, we kind of have to consider all possibilities. So kind of mixed messaging, I think, coming out of North Carolina right now, but they are trying to get some more control over whatever conference changes come for UNC. Because as many people have said, and we have said, UNC may actually be more appealing to the Big Ten and the SEC if they can get out of the ACC rather than Florida State, who is the one suing over everything. So something just to keep in mind.
Yeah, and as we continue to point out, a lot of interested parties watching what's happening with Florida State and the ACC before necessarily making moves. And I would put North Carolina in that group for sure. Okay, we are going to wrap things up with a quick mailbag question. This one's a really interesting one from Lance M. Is this possibly the end of the greatest era of college football? Saban, gone. Harbaugh, gone. CFP 4 games, gone. Student athletes, gone. Pay for play, here. College free agency, here. NIL, the dark money that drives roster, expanding. The only consistent is the incompetence of the NCAA. Have we spoiled what is or was undoubtedly the greatest form of sport on the globe? I'll let you start there.
So something I may have said earlier on this podcast feed, but I always think back to the EA Sports, the video game, and the lawsuit that stopped the game. The Ed O'Bannon lawsuit, some of the other lawsuits of basically players saying, hey, our name, image, and likeness is being used. We would like to be paid for that. Ed O'Bannon did not want the game to go away. EA Sports wanted to pay the players. The NCAA said no. It fought hard against everything for a very long time until the money got so big so fast that judges and state governments realized what was going on, and the public, and everything is completely shifted. Now you have all these changes all happening all at once. If they had let the players have their video game money, let them have a slice of the television revenue that was coming in, I don't think a lot of these other changes would have happened. But they did. And so now you have NIL and transfers and all these different things happening all at once because lawsuits are involved in courts and attorneys general and all these types of things. And college football is kind of being torn apart as we know it. And I do think that is unfortunate because I do think college football was one of the most unique things in the entire sporting world. And that's why a lot of us like it. But it couldn't stay that way forever when the money was getting as big as it was. You had to give some of it to the players. And the NCAA would not allow that to happen. And so it ended up starting to crumble a bit here and there by being attacked by every angle. And so I understand why a lot of fans are upset about things. I understand why it's harder to get invested if a really good player on your team is going to be gone the next year. or if he gets bought by another team and stuff like that. And a lot of these things should have been allowed a long time ago. Players should have been allowed to make money and allowed to do different things, but they weren't. And now we kind of have what we have. So I think it really sucks for fans. And I don't think we talk about that part enough because I think that matters. That's what keeps the sport going. So Lance, I completely feel where you're coming from. For me, the greatest era of college football was the mid 2000s. That's when I got into it. That was, I think, the height of the video game as well. That's kind of when I look back at it. That's the period I think of Vince Young, that type of stuff, that era, Tim Tebow. But it is a different game now. And I don't think it's going to go back to being that. And I think that is something being lost. But it's being lost because of leaders who kept their head in the sand forever and wouldn't let it change until change was forced upon them.
Yeah, and one other piece that's not even mentioned in that question is conference realignment, right? Because part of the reason that 2024 is such an influential, interesting tipping point type year, pivot point year, is because you have the new playoff, the 12-team playoff, but you also have the end of the Pac-12. You have a bigger Big Ten, a bigger SEC, a bigger ACC that is now coast to coast, and a new Big 12 as well. And I think that's all just going to feel very different. So you have that coupled with other pieces like the roster management piece with the portal and NIL and all of those things that are constantly evolving. And it really does feel very different from how it used to be. And I think the biggest challenge moving forward, especially because, as you said, Chris, decisions are being made for leadership because you have different challenges in the courts and you have Congress potentially getting involved or not, or where they choose to get involved, the DOJ, the NLRB. Decisions are coming down for leadership, but you also just have this in-between period where we know that this is not what the business model will look like. We know that these things are going to change. So you also have this feels like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, period. And I think that leads to some of this as well, about just looking back in the glory days and how things used to be, because it's murky. It's constantly changing. No one knew that collectives were going to become part of this era, right? Like someone just tried it and then it just kept happening. So then everyone made a collective and everyone started doing certain things a certain way. But this is all going to continue to change. And who knows, maybe eventually, I keep putting this out into the ether and I hope eventually it happens. There's a regionalization of college sports at some point, even if it's not for football, even if it's for all the other sports, that you eventually do go back and play your regional rivals and, travel makes more sense, right? So this stuff is going to continue to evolve and decisions will continue to be made. But this is what happens when something that was, amateur, that was tied to college becomes a billion-dollar industry, right? Like this is just sort of where it is now. It wanted to be more national. It wanted to be bigger. It wanted to be a bigger business. And here we are. And all of these things are changing all really at the same time. So I think
along like part of me to what you just said, it became a billion-dollar business, in which case part of me thinks a lot of this was inevitable. I think conference realignment as we've gone on was inevitable, because the Big Ten and the SEC just have a lot more fans. They have a lot more people watch their games. And as a result, the TV companies are going to just pay them a lot more money and more than the other conferences. And then that divide financially was always going to happen. And when you become a billion-dollar business, you can't stick with amateurism, at least in the way you had it. And so things needed to change over time and they wouldn't let it happen. And then it happened to them. And now nobody's really in control.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that these things are that the evolution of college sports is bad by any means. I know that it affects people's nostalgia and things like that. I also just think that in the question, about Saban and Harbaugh being gone, I mean, it's also the first time we've had this much coach teams that were in the playoff. We knew that Nick Saban was going to retire at some point, but it's still stunning to think about a college football world without him. Like some of those things are very unique and lead to that change and just sort of, oh my God, like what are we doing here? because it is going to be hard to imagine the sport without its elder statesman, without the GOAT there as well. So it's going to be really interesting. It's given us lots to talk about, and we'll continue to do that this off season. We will please continue to send us mailbag questions. We will answer them each week. There's just a loaded show. We had a lot to get into. So Chris, anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap things up today?
Yes. Technically, this may or may not be an episode of Power Hour, but I did want to end with the last call. And the last call is for you, Nicole, who got engaged over the last week while you're on vacation in Hawaii. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Got engaged on the golf course for our golfers out there. It was beautiful. It was a surprise. And it's so wonderful to hear from all of our friends and family. And thank you, Chris. That was very sweet of you. And thank you to our listeners. I got some congrats from a few of you as well. Very excited. And it was a good start to the off season. So I will be back from here on out, though. You're stuck with me. No more vacation. So look forward to hanging out with you guys on the Until Saturday feed. And like I said, we're going to be here all off season covering all of the big news. You can follow this podcast on Apple, wherever you get your podcast. Give us 5-star reviews, subscribe on YouTube. We're going to be going live on the Until Saturday page on YouTube as much as possible this off season as well. But that'll do it for today's show. Thanks again to Matt Brown for making us all a little smarter. Go subscribe to Extra Points. Chris Manini, I'm Nicole Auerbach. Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll talk to you guys again soon.